She ran her finger along the edge of the dining table and pretended she did not know what the word betrothed meant. Her mother said it slowly, as if speaking to a child who had never heard a proper sentence. Ilara, you are going to be betrothed to Lord Harwick. Do you understand what that means? Ilara blinked. She let her mouth fall open just slightly. She tilted her head to the side the way a confused puppy might, and she said, "Is that near the market?" Her mother pinched her eyes shut. That was the first time. Ilara was 16 years old, and she had just made the most important decision of her life, in less than 3 seconds. She decided she would be stupid. Not cruel, not rude, not difficult, just gently, consistently, irreparably simple. She would become the kind of girl that no ambitious man would ever want to tie himself to, not because she was unkind, but because she appeared to have absolutely nothing going on behind her eyes. It was the cleverest thing she had ever done. Lord Harwick never came back after that first dinner. He had sat across from her and asked her opinion on the new trade agreements being negotiated between their province and the Eastern Territories. Ilara had smiled warmly and said she thought the color blue was very calming. He had nodded slowly. He had not returned. What no one at that table understood, what no one would understand for the next 10 years, was that Ilara had read every document related to those trade agreements. She had read them twice. She had noted 3 major errors in the proposed clauses, and had quietly rewritten 2 of them in her private journal, for her own satisfaction, because she could not share that satisfaction with anyone. She could not share it because the moment she shared it, she would be useful. And the moment she was useful, she would be married off. Ilara was the second daughter of Lord Edmund Voss, a man of moderate land and considerable debt. She had one older sister, Clara, who was beautiful and well-spoken, and had been married at 17 to a man in the Northern Territory who bred horses. Clara had left with a trunk full of dresses and the expression of someone walking toward a known trap with no choice but to keep walking. She had written Ilara 1 letter in the first year. After that, nothing. Ilara had read that letter 14 times. In it, Clara said, "Do not be what they want, if you can help it." I could not help it. I hope you are cleverer than me. Clara did not know she was writing instructions, but Ilara received them as such. The Voss estate was not grand, but it had a library. Most people in the house did not use it. Her father sometimes walked through it on the way to his study. Her mother had never opened a book in Ilara's memory. The 2 housemaids dusted the shelves once a week. That was the full extent of traffic. Ilara used it every night after the candles in the main hall were put out. She had taught herself Latin at 14 by working through an old grammar text she found wedged behind a row of hunting records. She had moved on to philosophy at 15, then property law, then the history of land inheritance disputes in their region, then classical literature in 3 languages. She read medicine books and architectural texts, and 2 complete histories of their kingdom that contradicted each other in interesting ways. She read all of it in the dark, or nearly dark, with a single candle she shielded with her palm, when she heard footsteps in the corridor. During the day, she was a different person entirely. During the day, Ilara spilled things. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make people uncomfortable or suspicious. Just quietly, naturally, the way a person does when they are not paying attention. She would reach for the sugar bowl and miss it by 2 inches. She would add too much cream to her tea, and then look puzzled by the result. She would agree enthusiastically with statements that slightly contradicted each other and not notice. She would laugh at things that were not jokes and look confused by things that were. She was never unkind about it. That was the important part. Unkind would have drawn attention. Unkind would have made people wonder if there was something under the surface worth being unkind with. Ilara was instead cheerful and harmless, and genuinely warm to everyone she met, in the way that very simple people often are, because they have not yet learned to be strategic about affection. Except that Ilara was enormously strategic about everything. The second suitor her father arranged was a man named Lord Griffith. He was 41 and had buried 2 previous wives, and was looking for a third who would not cost him too much trouble. He came to the estate for a weekend visit in the autumn of Ilara's 17th year. He brought a gift, a small volume of poetry, and handed it to her with some ceremony. Ilara held it upside down. She admired the cover. She said it looked very thick. Lord Griffith left on Sunday morning instead of Monday. He told her father that she was a lovely girl, and he wished them well. Her father came to Alara that evening, with an expression she would see many more times over the following years, a complicated mixture of frustration, resignation, and something that might have been, if she were generous, a trace of embarrassed love. "Is everything well with you, Alara?" he asked. She said, "I think so." "Is Lord Griffith not coming to dinner?" Her father said, "No, Lord Griffith was not coming to dinner." She made herself look mildly sorry about this, not too sorry. Just a small, gentle, uncomplicated sorry, the kind that did not lead to questions. After he left, she opened the poetry book and read the whole thing in under an hour. It was not very good. 3 of the rhymes were forced, and one of the metaphors was borrowed from a much older poem, without credit. She put the book on her shelf with the spine facing inward, so no one would see the title and ask her about it. She added notes about it in her journal anyway, because the habit of writing down what she thought was the only outlet she had for being herself, and she had learned early that she needed that outlet desperately. Without it, she was afraid the whole weight of her hidden self would push through in a moment she could not afford. The journal lived under a loose floorboard beside her bed. She had tested the board at 15 to make sure it did not creak. It did not. By the time Alara was 19, the local families had developed a settled and affectionate view of her. She was sweet Alara Voss, not quite all there, bless her. A kind girl, of course. Pretty enough, in a soft way. But not the sort of match anyone with serious ambitions would pursue. There were whispers, said with more sympathy than cruelty, that it was a shame, really. That Lord Voss must be worried. That some men did not mind, of course, but most men had to think about what their families needed, and a wife who could not follow a conversation was not what most families needed. Alara heard these whispers regularly. She let them pass through her like wind through an open window. She was not bothered. She was, if she was honest with herself in those rare private moments when honesty was safe, actively relieved. Every whisper was a layer of protection. Every sigh of pity from a well-meaning neighbor was a brick in the wall she was building around herself, the wall that kept her from being handed to a stranger and told to build her life inside his. She had seen enough of the women around her to understand what that life looked like. She had watched her mother negotiate the space of a marriage that had never been equal, smoothing over things, and going around things, and pretending not to see things, year after patient year. She had watched her aunt spend 2 decades in a house where her intelligence was treated as a minor inconvenience at best. She had listened to the older women at dinners and gatherings, the way they talked to each other in careful half-sentences, communicating entire chapters of experience in things they did not quite say. She understood. She had understood from very young, and she had decided, with a clarity that surprised even her, that she would not do it. She would not enter that life through the door of a marriage arranged by men who had no interest in who she actually was. If she ever entered it at all, it would be through a door she chose herself. So she kept pretending. She got better at it over time. In the early years, there were moments when she slipped, when something genuinely interesting was said at a dinner table, and her eyes sharpened before she could stop them, when a book was mentioned that she had read and loved, and she nearly said so before she caught herself. She developed tactics to handle these moments. She learned to redirect her sharpening attention into what looked like a simple question, not a smart question, just a childlike one. "Oh, is that the book with the red cover?" Or she would turn it into mild confusion. "I tried to read that, but I kept getting muddled." It worked. People want to believe what is convenient for them to believe. A reputation, once established, becomes a lens through which everything is interpreted. Her minor slips were absorbed into the existing story about her. She was a sweet, simple girl who occasionally surprised you by knowing something small. That was all. That was the story. And the story held. The 3rd suitor came when she was 20. The 4th when she was 21. The 5th when she was 22. Each departed within a week. Her father stopped looking wounded about it after the 4th. By the 5th, he simply nodded when the man left and did not raise the subject with Alara at all. She felt a complicated sadness about this, which she allowed herself to feel only at night, in the library, alone. She did not think her father was a bad man. She thought he was a man shaped by his time and his world, who genuinely did not know how to understand a daughter who did not fit the shape he expected her to have. He was not cruel, he was not unkind, he was just unable to see her, and she had made herself impossible to see, which was both the solution and the grief. She wrote about it sometimes in the journal, about the loneliness of the thing, about how it was a specific and particular loneliness, the loneliness of being seen only as a performance you yourself had made up, and knowing that the performance was both saving you and costing you something you could not name. She wrote about her sister Clara sometimes too, wondering if she was all right, hoping the horses were kind things to be around. She thought about the future occasionally, really thought about it, not as a worry, but as a question she was genuinely curious about. She did not know what she wanted her life to look like in the long run. She knew what she did not want. She knew she did not want to be managed and guided and talked around, but she was not sure what the alternative looked like, in a world where women of her class had very few official alternatives. She did not have an answer. She let the question sit. She kept reading. She kept pretending. She kept filling the journal with things no one else would ever read. And the years moved on, the way years do, without asking anyone's permission. By the time she was 23, the local families had stopped actively trying to arrange matches for her. It happened gradually. First, the suggestions became less frequent. Then they became light and unconvinced. Then they stopped entirely. Her mother had taken up a posture of quiet acceptance on the subject. Her father, at some point she could not precisely identify, had let go of it altogether. She had become, in the eyes of her world, simply Alara, not a problem to be solved, not a daughter to be settled. Just the younger Voss girl, a fixture of the house and the surrounding community. Pleasant to be around, not quite suited for anything in particular. It was, from the outside, a sad story. From the inside, it was the freest she had ever been. She had begun, in her 22nd year, to do something she had not done before. She had begun to act, very quietly and from the background, on the things she actually knew. There was a dispute among 3 neighboring families over an inherited parcel of land. It had dragged on for years. She had read the original inheritance documents when they were being discussed in her father's study. She had been sitting in the corner doing what she always did in those situations, which was to make herself look pleasantly vacant while listening to every word. She had spotted the misreading that was driving the dispute immediately. The original text used an ambiguous term that had been interpreted 2 different ways, and both sides had built their cases on their respective interpretations. She had written out a correct reading of the document, with references, and given it to her father without explanation. Folded inside a letter she claimed had been delivered to her by mistake. A small, clumsy story that he barely questioned, because she was Alara, and Alara did not do complicated things. Her father had brought it to the family's solicitors. The dispute was resolved in 6 weeks. Her father never knew where the correct reading came from. He thought it had been in the mislaid letter. He had mentioned it once at dinner, as an interesting turn of events, and Alara had said, "Oh, that's nice," and eaten her soup. She had felt something warm and quiet in her chest for the rest of that evening. Something that was not pride exactly, but was adjacent to it, the satisfaction of a thing done well, even invisibly. She began doing it more. Not often, and never in ways that pointed back to her. A word passed through her father at the right moment, a document she left on a table where it would be found, an observation she made in the voice of a confused question, which led someone else to think of the right answer themselves. She became, without anyone knowing it, a small and invisible force for sensible decisions in her corner of the world. And she was 26 years old, and she was still unmarried, and she had been pretending to be simple for 10 full years, and she had become so practiced at it that she no longer had to think about it very much, and the life she had built inside herself, the real life, the one in the library and the journal and the quiet satisfactions, she allowed no one to see. That life was full. Not perfect, not without loneliness, but full. She had no reason to think anything would change. She did not know that a man named Duke Aldrich Kane had accepted an invitation to visit the Whitmore estate 7 miles down the road. She did not know that his visit would extend longer than planned. She did not know that he would, one afternoon 3 weeks into that extended visit, accept a dinner invitation from the Voss family. She did not know that he was the kind of man who watched people the way other men watched landscapes, not casually, but with attention, looking for what was true underneath what was visible. She did not know any of it. She was in the library when the invitation arrived, sitting cross-legged on the reading bench with a candle and a philosophical text she found genuinely exciting. making notes in the margins in her smallest handwriting. She put the book away carefully. She hid the notes. She went to bed. She would be ready, she told herself. She was always ready. 10 years of practice, and she had never been caught. She did not know yet that being ready would not be enough. She did not know that the evening of that dinner would be the last ordinary night of the life she had so carefully built, and that by the time it ended, the 10-year performance she had given every single day of her adult life would begin, for the first time, to quietly come apart. But that was later. That night, she slept well. She always slept well. A clear conscience, she had found, was the unexpected reward of a life lived entirely on her own terms, even when those terms required a great deal of pretending. She closed her eyes. Outside, the province slept, and somewhere down the road, a man she had not yet met was sitting awake by a fire, thinking about something he could not quite put into words yet, reading a book he had already finished twice, waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for the morning to come. The dress Elara chose for the dinner was the soft green one that made her look pleasant and unremarkable. She had 3 dresses that could be described in approximately those terms, and she rotated them for occasions that required her to look like someone who had not thought too hard about what to wear. The deliberate dullness of her wardrobe was itself a calculation she never discussed with anyone. Her mother had asked her once, years ago, why she never wore the blue silk that had been made for her at considerable cost. Elara had looked at the blue silk with mild affection and said she found it complicated to put on. Her mother had given up. The blue silk was, in fact, Elara's favorite thing she owned. She wore it sometimes in her room at night, when she was reading. She was not sure exactly why this pleased her so much, perhaps because it felt like a small, private version of being herself. She wore the green dress to the dinner. The Voss dining room was not large, but her mother had arranged it well for the evening. The table had been set with care. 6 people were expected, including the Duke and the elder Mr. Whitmore, who had brought him along as a kind of social presentation, in the way that people in their circle sometimes presented interesting guests to each other. Elara came downstairs at the right time, walked in the right way, not slowly enough to seem like she was being careful, not quickly enough to seem like she was eager, and took her usual seat near the end of the table, where she could see everything, without being the center of attention. She had a system. The first thing she did upon entering any room with new people was to notice them without appearing to. She had been doing this for so long that it was nearly automatic. She clocked details, the way a reader notes the first line of a chapter, quickly, fully, and with the understanding that this information would matter later. She noticed the Duke the moment he stood to greet her mother. Not because of anything dramatic. He was not extraordinary to look at in any simple way. He was tall and well-built, with dark hair that was beginning to show the earliest suggestion of gray at the sides, and the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor weather and habitual self-discipline into something that was not conventionally handsome, so much as genuinely striking. He moved with economy, nothing wasted, nothing performed. He shook her father's hand and said something that made her father laugh, and then he sat down, and the first thing he did after sitting down was to look around the room once, quietly, in the way that people do when they want to understand where they are, before they commit to being anywhere. Their eyes did not meet during that scan. He did not linger on her. She was, from the outside, the uninteresting one at the end of the table, and he moved his attention past her the way a person reads a line that does not require annotation. She noted the fact that he had done a full scan of the room. She filed it away. The dinner began. Elara deployed her usual toolkit with the precision of long experience. She added too much salt to her soup, noticed it too late, and made a small face that communicated gentle bewilderment. She asked Mr. Whitmore a question about his horses that was 2 conversational steps behind the current thread, so that it landed slightly wrong and required a patient redirect. She laughed at something her father said that had not quite been a joke, with the good-natured warmth of a person who finds people generally delightful and does not always track why. She watched the Duke from the edge of her attention the whole time. He was talking to her father and Mr. Whitmore. The conversation was about regional commerce, a new road being planned through the Eastern Passage, and how it would affect the movement of goods. It was, genuinely, an interesting topic if you understood anything about the existing infrastructure and its limitations. The Duke appeared to understand quite a lot. He spoke in the measured way of someone who had done his reading and did not feel the need to perform the having done it. Her father was nodding. Mr. Whitmore was enthusiastic. The Duke was making a specific point about the flood risk to the proposed southern route, and the point was correct. And he was making it calmly, without seeming to notice or care that he was the only person at the table who had thought of it. Alara thought of 4 additional points about the southern route that he had not mentioned. She ate her soup quietly. About 40 minutes into dinner, during a pause in the main conversation, the Duke addressed her for the first time. "Miss Voss," he said, in a voice that was pleasant but not particularly warm. "Do you enjoy riding?" It was the kind of question people asked her, a simple question, easy to answer simply. "I do like horses," she said, with the particular tone she had developed for these moments, friendly, but slightly missed, as if she had answered a question that was nearly the one he had asked. "They are very large." Mr. Whitmore smiled kindly. Her father continued eating. Her mother made a small sound that was not quite anything. The Duke said, "Yes, they are," and turned back to the main conversation. She expected that to be the end of it. It usually was the end of it. But about 20 minutes later, when the plates were being cleared, and the conversation had shifted to the ongoing building work at one of the local church properties, Alara watched the Duke set down his fork and rest one hand on the table, and she watched him, very briefly, glance at her. Not the way people usually glanced at her, which was with the automatic soft allowance one extends to someone who does not need to be engaged seriously. He glanced at her in the specific way a person glances at something that has produced a small question in their mind. A quick, quiet, purposeful glance that was not looking at her expression so much as looking at the space slightly behind it. She looked back at him with the gentle blankness she had perfected. He looked away. But she noticed it, and the noticing produced, in the very back of her mind, a small and specific discomfort that she had almost never felt before. The discomfort of someone who was used to not being seen doing a very good job of not being seen, and who had just sensed, not been seen, not been caught, just sensed, that a new variable had entered the situation. She filed that too. After dinner, the adults moved to the sitting room. Alara followed, found a chair near the window, and accepted a cup of tea from the maid. She held the cup in both hands, and let her eyes drift to the window, in the comfortable way of someone whose thoughts were not going anywhere, in particular. Her thoughts were going everywhere. She was reviewing the dinner in detail, the way she always did after any social event that involved new people. Most people left no residue worth reviewing. They were exactly what they appeared to be, comfortable, mostly kind, operating on the visible surface of things. She catalogued them and set them aside. The Duke was not leaving residue she could set aside. He sat across the room with a cup of tea and a polite expression, and said the right things to her father, and she could not locate a single concrete thing he had done that should have concerned her. The glance at dinner, the full room scan when he entered, the point about the southern road. These were not evidence of anything. They were the behaviors of an observant person. There were other observant people in the world. She had managed them all without incident. She reminded herself of this. She told herself that she was being overly cautious because he was unfamiliar, and newness always produced a temporary heightening of her attention. She told herself that by next week he would be back at the Whitmore estate, or traveling on to the next appointment, and she would never see him again, and this slight unease would dissolve. She told herself this, and she mostly believed it. Across the room, the Duke was laughing at something her father had said, a real laugh that crinkled his eyes, and for just a moment, he looked far more approachable than he had all evening. Then the laugh settled, and his face returned to its usual composed arrangement, and he set his teacup down, and without looking toward the window at all, he said, "Miss Voss, do you find the garden interesting in this season?" Everyone looked at her. It was a harmless question. A perfectly ordinary question. "I like flowers," she said, "the yellow ones." Her father nodded with practiced patience. The Duke smiled, a small, almost private smile, and said, "Yes, a good season for yellow ones." He did not pursue it. He turned back to her father. The conversation moved on. But the smile had been wrong, not unfriendly, not mocking. Wrong in the specific sense that it had been a little too controlled, a little too closed. The smile of a person pressing something flat who does not want it to show. She had made that smile herself, on the inside, approximately 6,000 times in 10 years. She recognized it. She looked back out the window and did not allow her expression to change. The rest of the evening passed without incident. The Duke and Mr. Whitmore left at a reasonable hour. Her father shook hands with everyone. Her mother said the appropriate things. Ilara stood near the door and smiled gently at the correct moments and did not look the Duke in the eye as he left. He did not try to make her. She went to bed. She lay awake for a while, which was unusual. She was almost always asleep within minutes of putting her head down. She had found, over the years, that a life lived without unresolved tensions tends to produce easy sleep. Tonight there was a tension she could not immediately resolve, and she lay in the dark turning it over. It was probably nothing. He was probably simply an observant man who found everything slightly interesting, which was a personality type she was familiar with and had handled before. She was probably reacting to nothing more than the novelty of someone who paid attention as a general habit, and she was mistaking that general attention for something specific directed at her. She told herself this until it began to feel true. She slept. In the morning she came downstairs and found a note on the table from her mother, who had gone to call on a neighbor. Her father was in his study. The house was quiet. She made herself tea. She sat in the kitchen, which she preferred to the formal rooms when the house was empty. She thought about the eastern trade route and the problem with the proposed passage through the Southern Valley, and she thought about 3 things the Duke had said that had been, upon reflection, smarter than they appeared on the surface. She thought, for a moment, about what it would be like to talk to someone like that. To actually talk. To say a real sentence and have someone respond to the sentence you actually said, rather than the simple version they expected. She pressed that thought flat. She had pressed it flat many times before. She was good at it. She finished her tea and went to the library and opened her book and read for 2 hours and felt entirely herself again. She was fine, she told herself. She was fine. What she did not know was that the Duke, riding back to the Whitmore estate in the early light of that morning, was also thinking about the dinner. He was thinking about the moment she had answered his question about riding. He was a man who read people for professional reasons. It had been a necessary skill in the years of his career, and he had developed, over time, an ability to notice the small involuntary movements that contradicted a performed surface. When she had said, "They are very large," there had been, in the fraction of a second before the words came out, a compression in her expression, barely visible, the kind of thing a person makes when they are choosing between what they want to say and what they have decided to say, and the choosing takes just a moment longer than it should. He had seen it, he had not reacted. He was not yet certain of anything. But he was curious. He was specifically, particularly, professionally, curious, in the way that he could not simply put down when he rode away. He had, in the morning ride back, made a quiet and entirely internal decision to accept the next dinner invitation from the Voss family, if one came. He did not know exactly what he was looking for. He was fairly certain he would know it when he found it. The second dinner at the Voss estate was 3 weeks later, and Ilara had spent those 3 weeks telling herself that it would not happen, and then telling herself that if it happened it did not matter, and then telling herself, in the final days before it did happen, that she had survived 10 years of every kind of dinner, and she would survive this one too. She wore the other green dress, the slightly darker one. There were more people this time. Her father had made it a broader gathering, 8 people at the table, which suited Ilara in the way that larger groups always did. More noise, more conversations to fragment, more places for her attention to appear to be without actually being there. The Duke arrived with Mr. Whitmore again, and this time also with a younger man who was being introduced as Whitmore's nephew, a pleasant person named Owen, who had recently come back from 2 years abroad and was very enthusiastic about everything he had seen, and not at all shy about sharing it. Owen sat next to Ilara and talked to her for most of the first course. He was the kind of person who did not require much response. He was happy to carry a conversation on his own energy, and he directed warmth at everyone around him in the indiscriminate way of someone who genuinely liked people. She liked him immediately, and without reservation. He was exactly the sort of person her performance required no effort around, because he was so busy being interested in his own stories that he did not examine hers. He was further down the table this time, between her father and a neighbor named Mr. Alderton, who was a large man with opinions about agriculture that he expressed at volume. The Duke was listening to Mr. Alderton with every appearance of genuine interest, occasionally asking a question that redirected the conversation with surgical efficiency, without Mr. Alderton noticing he was being redirected. She watched this happen 3 times, and felt something she rarely felt in social situations, which was the specific appreciation of a technique she admired. She was careful not to let that appreciation show on her face. She returned her attention to Owen, who was explaining the differences between 3 types of fishing boats he had encountered abroad. Later, during the main course, there was a shift in the seating arrangement that happened when Mr. Alderton moved to speak to someone on his other side, and her father leaned to speak with the couple beside him. The Duke, momentarily freed from conversation, reached for his glass, and in doing so, turned slightly toward her end of the table. Their eyes met directly for the first time. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She gave him the soft, pleasant nothing she gave everyone. A slight smile. A blink. Eyes that held no particular thought. He looked at her with that same quality she had noticed at the first dinner. Attention without performance. Then Owen said something beside her, and she turned, and the moment was over. But those 2 seconds had communicated something that she could not quite translate, and was not comfortable with. She had spent 10 years making eye contact with people, and giving them nothing to read. She was exceptional at it. She had made eye contact with clever people, skeptical people, people who prided themselves on reading others, and given them all nothing. The Duke's 2 seconds had not felt like nothing going out. They had felt like something coming in, like someone reading a page she had thought was blank. She did not like that feeling. She liked control. She had given up many things to maintain control over her own presentation, and she was not accustomed to sitting in a room and feeling that control become slightly permeable. She ate her food and talked to Owen, and did not allow herself to seem any different than she always did. And under the surface, she was recalibrating. She needed to know how much he knew, or suspected, or was simply instinctively sensing without having organized it into thought yet. After dinner, the group moved to the sitting room and broke into smaller conversations. Ilara sat near the window, with her tea in both hands, in her usual position. Owen had found someone else to talk to, the young woman from the neighboring estate who was visiting her cousin. Good. Ilara needed room to think. The Duke walked across the room with his own cup, and stopped near the window, not beside her exactly, 1.5 feet away, facing slightly out rather than toward her, in the way that suggested he was looking at the garden rather than visiting with her. "The yellow roses are past their best," he said. He said it conversationally, to no one in particular, but they were the only 2 people near the window. "They were very pretty last month," she said. "Simple, easy, warm and uninteresting." "Do you spend time out there?" "Sometimes. I like to sit in the garden." She let a small, soft pause follow, as if she was thinking of something not very complicated. "The birds come." "What kind of birds?" She knew exactly what kind of birds. She had spent years observing them, had read 2 ornithology texts, knew their Latin classifications, and seasonal migration patterns, and could identify 7 species by call alone. She let her face go slightly upward, as if consulting a limited memory. "The small brown ones," she said, "and sometimes bigger ones." He turned his head toward her slightly, not fully, just enough to put her in his peripheral view. "That does cover most of them," he said. There was something in his tone, not mockery, not condescension, something that was almost dry, the faintest possible edge of something that was nearly humor, very carefully contained. She held her pleasantly vague expression and said, "I suppose it does," as if she had not noticed the tone. He turned back to the window. A few seconds passed. Then he said, without any particular weight on the words, "Your father mentioned you have read some of the books in his library." This was a trap. She recognized it immediately. The question was designed to let her either confirm that she had read things, which would create follow-up questions she would have to navigate, or deny it, which would be either verifiable or telling in its own way. She said, "I have looked at them sometimes. There are many with pictures." He said. Just that, nothing else. He drank his tea and looked at the garden and made no further comment, and after a few minutes, he moved away and joined the conversation across the room, and Ilara sat at the window and breathed out very slowly and carefully thought about what had just happened. He had asked about the library, specifically. Not about her hobbies in general. Not about needlework or music or any of the topics people typically use to fill a polite conversation with an uninteresting young woman. The library. And he had asked it immediately after a conversational pause, which meant it had been in his mind, and he had chosen a moment to deploy it. That was intentional. She was sure of it. The question was, what had he seen that had brought him to that particular question? She ran the evening backward in careful detail. She had been consistent. She had not slipped. The eye contact. That had felt different, but feeling was not evidence. He could not have read anything from 2 seconds of eye contact. She was experienced enough to know that. And yet, she needed to be more careful. Whatever he was sensing, and she was becoming increasingly convinced he was sensing something, even if he could not name it, she needed to close off the avenues. She needed to be more thoroughly Alara for the next few weeks, if he remained in the area. More warmly vacant, more cheerfully opaque. She could do it. She had done it for 10 years. She was better at it than she had ever been. She made herself believe this. She was mostly successful. The evening ended. Coats were collected. Goodbyes were said. She stood in the hallway and smiled at everyone in the right way, and said the right nothing sentences, and watched the guests leave. The Duke said goodnight to her at the door. Just goodnight. A brief, courteous word, his eyes on her, for exactly as long as was polite, his expression pleasant and neutral. She said goodnight back. She went upstairs. She got into bed. She lay there and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Somewhere in the middle of the night, she admitted to herself something that was uncomfortable to admit. She was not worried about him the way she was worried about suitors. She was not worried about being matched with him, or managed by him, or handed to him. She was worried about being seen by him, which was different, and in some ways harder. She had structured her entire life around the comfort of invisibility. She had paid a considerable price for that invisibility, and she had decided it was worth the price. She had never wavered on that. And now there was a man 7 miles down the road who looked at her twice and made her feel, in the most disconcerting way, very nearly visible. She turned over and pressed her face into the pillow and told herself firmly that it did not matter. She was 26 years old. She was good at this. She had never been caught. She was not going to be caught now. But even as she thought it, something small and contrary stirred in the back of her mind. Something she had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not quite fear, and not quite anticipation, and had no clean name she could find for it in any of the books she had read. She pressed it flat. She slept, eventually, after a long while. Outside, the moon moved across the province, and somewhere in the Whitmore estate, a man sat by a dying fire, with a nearly empty glass, and the quiet, settled feeling of someone who has found the first thread of something interesting, and is beginning, carefully, to pull. 3 days after the second dinner, without warning or announcement, the library at the Voss estate became the location of the most consequential moment in Alara's decade of careful performance, and it happened because she made one mistake. The mistake was small, entirely forgivable under any normal reading of events. She had checked the corridor. She had listened for footsteps. She had waited until she was certain the house was settled for the afternoon, and no one was likely to pass through the east wing for at least 2 hours. These were her standard precautions, and they had never failed her. What she had not checked was the garden entrance. The library had a side door that opened onto the east garden. It was almost never used. She had not thought about it in months. She was standing on a stepladder reaching for a volume she needed, and she had been in the room for almost an hour, and she had, because she was alone and certain of it, let herself be entirely herself. She was humming something low and quiet. She had a second book open on the shelf below, propped against the spines of the neighboring volumes, marking the page she was cross-referencing. She was wearing her indoor slippers. Her hair was loose. She had a pencil tucked behind her ear. She had just found the passage she needed in the upper volume, a specific section of an old property law text she had referenced in her head that morning when reviewing a matter her father had mentioned offhand, and she had murmured something to herself that was approximately, "There it is," in a tone of quiet satisfaction, when she heard the garden door open. She heard it, and she reacted, but the reaction was half a second too slow. The Duke walked in from the garden with a book in his hand, and a slightly apologetic expression forming. The expression of someone who has unexpectedly interrupted something, and then he stopped. He stopped because what he saw in front of him was not what he expected to see. He saw a young woman on a stepladder, in indoor slippers, with her hair down and a pencil behind her ear, cross-referencing two books simultaneously, with the focused, comfortable ease of someone who did this all the time and had never considered it unusual. For the half-second before her performance caught up with her reality, he saw her. And then her performance caught up. Her face went through a change she executed as fast as she ever had. The sharpness that had been there flattened. Her posture shifted from the straightness of absorbed concentration to the slightly softer arrangement of someone who had been doing something mild. Her hand, that had been moving with purpose, stilled and became uncertain. She blinked, as if the interruption had caught her thinking something simple rather than something complex. "Oh," she said. "Hello." Her voice came out exactly right, a little startled, a little warm, a little nowhere in particular. The Duke stood still for a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then he said, "I am very sorry to intrude. Mr. Whitmore suggested I might return the volume I borrowed from your father. I was told the library was accessible from the garden." He held up the book in his hand, demonstrating it. "Oh," she said again. "Of course." She began to come down from the stepladder, slowly, with slightly less coordination than she was capable of. The Duke walked into the room. He did not look at her directly. He moved to the shelves to one side, glancing at the labels, appearing to look for where to return the borrowed volume. She got down from the ladder. She smoothed her dress. She looked at the book in her hands and set it down on the reading bench nearby, as if she had simply been carrying it. He found the correct shelf and slid the borrowed volume back into place. Then, without apparently planning to, he stopped. His eyes had landed on the two books on the shelf, the ones she had been cross-referencing. The propped open one was still angled against its neighbors. The other, the one she had been reaching for, was on the reading bench now, closed. He looked at the propped book for a moment, then he looked at the bench. Then, very briefly, he looked at her. "Which section were you looking at?" he said. The question was quiet, almost casual, almost the kind of thing one asks without thinking. "I was not really reading," she said. "I just like looking at the pictures." There was a pause. "That one does not have pictures," he said. She looked at the book on the bench, as if discovering this for the first time. "Oh," she said. "I thought it did." Another pause, slightly longer. He did not contradict her. He did not press. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when they are making a decision about something. Then he said, "My mistake. I should have come to the front entrance. I apologize for interrupting you." "You are not interrupting," she said. "I was just sitting." He looked at her for just a moment, not the half-second glance from the dinners. A direct look, a real one, that lasted long enough to be a choice. Then he said, "Of course. Good afternoon, Miss Voss." He went back through the garden door. She did not move for a full 10 seconds after it closed. Then she sat down on the reading bench and put her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular and tried to assess the damage. She ran through it. What had he seen exactly? A woman on a ladder with books, hair down, pencil behind ear, two books cross-referenced, one without pictures that she claimed to have been looking at for pictures. He had seen that. She had recovered quickly. Her response had been as clean as it was possible to make a late response. Her voice had been right. Her face had been right. But the pencil, she had not removed the pencil from behind her ear in time. She had been wearing it when he looked at her the first time. People who could not really read did not walk around with pencils behind their ears in libraries. Or if they did, it was the kind of coincidental detail that a very observant person might note. She reached up and took the pencil from behind her ear and held it in her hand and looked at it. This was a problem. Not a disaster, not a confirmed exposure, but a problem in a way that none of the last 10 years had produced. She had been sloppy. She had let the safety of her private hours make her careless, and he had walked through the one entrance she had not considered. She told herself it was still salvageable. She had explained the books. She had given him a reason, however thin. He might think she was the kind of person who wandered into libraries and picked things up without understanding them. That was possible. That was consistent with her established character. She did not feel very convinced. She put the pencil in her pocket. She tidied the books. She left the library and went back to the main part of the house and sat in the parlor and picked up some needlework and did it with the comfortable, unhurried inaccuracy she had perfected over years, and she thought about what she was going to do next. What she could not know, sitting in the parlor with her needlework and her calculation, was that the Duke had not gone back to the Whitmore estate when he left through the garden door. He had gone to the bench under the old oak tree at the garden's edge and sat down and thought for a while. He had been a careful and observant man for his entire adult life. He had developed this quality partly by nature and partly by necessity, in years of work that required him to understand situations quickly and under conditions where being wrong had real consequences. He trusted his observations. He had learned not to dismiss what he saw in favor of what was more convenient to believe. What he had seen in the library was not consistent with what he had been told and shown at 2 dinners. It was not even close to consistent. The books, the posture, the pencil, the way she had been moving, not the careful, slightly uncoordinated way of a person navigating an unfamiliar space, but the automatic, comfortable movement of someone completely at home, the sound, brief as it was, of someone who had found something they were looking for, spoken in a voice that was nothing like the voice she used downstairs. He did not know what it meant, entirely. He had guesses. They were the kind of guesses he did not want to have been wrong about, because being wrong would mean he had misread a person very badly, which was unusual for him, and uncomfortable to contemplate. But he did not think he was wrong. He sat under the oak tree for 20 minutes. Then he stood up and walked back to his horse and rode toward the Whitmore estate at a thoughtful pace. He was going to have to find out. He was the kind of person who, once a question presented itself in this particular way, clearly, specifically, with evidence attached, could not put it down without an answer. He was going to find out carefully. He was not going to startle her. He was not going to confront her. He was simply going to pay attention, in the patient way he was good at, and wait for the picture to complete itself. He did not know that Alara was sitting in the parlor 3/4 of a mile away, with the same quality of expression on her face, for the same reason, with the same patient certainty that the answer would come if she was careful enough. They were, without knowing it yet, doing the same thing. They were both very good at it. The question that neither of them had yet asked was what would happen when one of them was no longer careful enough. The week that followed was quiet on the surface, and not quiet at all underneath. Alara did what she always did when she had a problem to manage. She became more controlled, more consistent, more thoroughly the person she had decided to be in public. She went to 2 neighborhood gatherings and performed her role so smoothly that afterward she felt a kind of flat tiredness that she recognized as the cost of exceptional effort sustained at length. She thought about the library every day. She thought about it the way you think about a loose thread on a garment, not in a panic, but with an awareness that pulling it could do a great deal of damage, and that the smartest approach was to monitor it rather than yank it. She reviewed what he had seen. She revised her assessment. She came to the conclusion that if he had definite proof of anything, he would have done something with it by now. He had not done anything. There had been no questions from her father, no change in the neighborhood's tone, no approach to her. So he had not done anything, which meant either he was uncertain, or he was biding his time, or he had decided it did not matter and had moved on. The third possibility comforted her the most. She did not entirely believe it. She found herself, in the evenings when she was alone in the library, occasionally imagining a version of events in which she did something she had never done, in which she said something real to someone. Not everything, not immediately, not recklessly, but something. A real sentence in a real conversation, with a person who was capable of receiving it. She always stopped the imagining before it went very far. It was a dangerous thought, not because the conversation was impossible, but because the wanting of it was. She had not wanted it in a long time, and she had believed she had trained the wanting out of herself, and finding it alive and specific was unsettling. She pressed it flat. She read her books. She went to bed. The Duke, meanwhile, was doing something she would have recognized if she had known about it. He was being methodical. He had extended his stay at the Whitmore estate without making a production of it. He had a legitimate reason. There was genuine business being discussed with Mr. Whitmore regarding a shared property matter, and extending the visit while that was finalized was reasonable. He was not uncomfortable in the country. He was not uncomfortable with patients. He had arranged his professional life in a way that allowed him to take time, when time was what the situation required. He began attending more of the local gatherings. He observed her at each one with the careful, peripheral attention he had learned to deploy, when he did not want the subject of his observation to know they were being observed. He was looking for the seam, the place where one version met the other. He had caught a glimpse of it in the library, but a glimpse was not the same as understanding, and he was not a person who moved on insufficient understanding. At the first gathering he attended that week, she spilled her tea. A small, natural, unconvincing spill. He watched it happen, and noticed, for the first time, because now he was looking for it, that her hand had been entirely steady in the second before it moved. The spill was not an accident. It was too even. The cup had moved in exactly the right direction to tip at exactly the right angle. He kept his expression entirely neutral. At the second gathering, she answered a question about the upcoming harvest season with a mild, wandering answer that technically responded to the wrong half of the question. He watched her eyes in the half-second before the answer came out. They were clear and direct, and had understood the full question perfectly. He kept his expression entirely neutral. He was not angry. He was not offended. He was something else, something that he did not immediately have a word for, something that was adjacent to admiration, but larger than that, and more complicated, and involved a kind of recognition that he was not yet ready to examine closely. He was beginning to understand that what he was looking at was not a simple concealment. What he was looking at was a piece of work, a sustained, elaborate, intelligent construction that had been maintained across years and social situations and family dynamics, with no cracks showing and no one the wiser. That was not a small thing. That was not a trivial or casual thing. He had known, in his professional life, people who maintained constructed identities. He had worked alongside them. He understood the particular cost of that kind of maintenance, and the particular quality of person it required. But you had to be very clear about yourself on the inside, to perform something different on the outside every day, without losing the thread. You had to know exactly where the floor of your own identity was, so that no amount of surface-level performance could take you below it. He thought about this. He thought about what it would take to do what she was doing, and for how long she had apparently been doing it, and why. He thought he was beginning to understand the why, the world she lived in, the options available to her within it. He had grown up in that world too, and he had his own version of the same constrictions, and he had resisted them differently, but not less. He did not say any of this to anyone. He went to the third gathering with a specific intention. He was going to test something, not a trap, not a trick designed to expose or embarrass, just a small, careful question that would tell him something he needed to know, to understand how wide the gap was between what she showed and what was underneath. She was near the fireplace when he approached, talking to an older woman about the arrangements for the upcoming church fair. Her expression was open and warmly simple. She was doing it so well that if he had not been specifically watching for it, he would have seen nothing remarkable at all. He waited for the older woman to move away, which she did after a minute, and then he said, quietly, in a conversational tone, "Have you read anything interesting recently?" She smiled, with the gentle vacancy she deployed for most questions. "I have not been reading much," she said. "I find it tiring." "That is a shame," he said. "I was hoping for a recommendation. Your father mentioned the library here is quite well stocked, for a house of its size." A flicker. Almost nothing. A micro-compression of the muscles around her eyes, gone before it had fully arrived. "There are many books," she said. "I do not know the titles very well." "I saw one on the bench when I returned my volume," he said. "A property law text. Rather dry reading, I imagine." She looked at him with pleasant, mild puzzlement. "Was there? I do not know much about books like that." He said, "No," in a tone that was perfectly agreeable. He watched her. She held the expression exactly. Not a crack, not a breath. But the flicker had been there. He had seen it. It was the kind of micro-expression that required a person to know what they were looking at, but he knew what he was looking at. She was brilliant at this. He excused himself from the conversation after another minute and moved away, and he stood across the room with a cup of something he was not tasting, and came to a final and settled conclusion that he had been working toward for 10 days. She was not what she appeared. She was, under the performance, almost certainly the opposite, and she had been doing this, apparently, for long enough that it was deeply embedded in the way her household and community saw her. He felt the weight of that. He let himself feel it fully. Then he made a decision. Not about what to do. Not yet. He needed one more piece. Not for proof. He was already past needing proof. But for context. He needed to understand the scale of what she had built. How deep the knowledge went. Whether it was surface cleverness or something more substantial. He had thought of a way to find out. It would require the library. It would require patience. It would require the garden door. He was good at all three. Across the room, Ilara set her cup down on a side table and turned to greet someone she knew, and smiled with warmth and ease, and said something that produced laughter from the small group around her, and she was so completely the person she had always been in public that anyone watching would have seen nothing but a pleasant, simple woman at a social gathering with nothing on her mind. But her hands, as she turned, were cold. She had felt the question about the property law text land exactly the way a well-placed question lands when someone has already found the answer and is simply confirming it. He knew something. She was no longer questioning whether he knew something. What she was now questioning, and this was the question that made her hands cold, was what he was going to do with it. She had no way of knowing his intentions. She had no way of knowing whether he was methodical and patient, or whether he was building toward an exposure she could not predict. She had no map for this situation. 10 years, and she had never needed one. She smiled at the people around her, and listened to the conversation, and contributed to it in her established way. And underneath all of that, she was very, very quietly beginning to understand that something was shifting in the foundation of the life she had built. She did not know the word for the feeling yet. She would know it soon. On the morning of the estate documents, the crisis came without warning, which was the only way a real crisis ever came. It started before breakfast, with a knock at the front door, while the household was still only half awake. A solicitor had arrived, a man named Mr. Pierce, representing a claim against the Voss family land. He had documents. He had a witness. He had an expression of professional regret that, to anyone who understood the look, communicated that the regret was decorative rather than genuine. Ilara's father heard the knock and went downstairs in his morning coat, and the solicitor began talking, and within 4 minutes, her father had come to the foot of the stairs and called up to her mother in a voice she had heard him use only twice before, a voice that was very controlled, in a way that meant something was very wrong. Ilara was already awake. She heard the solicitor's voice through the floor. She understood most of what she heard, because she recognized the language of property claims. She had read enough of them, studied enough of the formal phrasing, encountered enough disputes in the documents her father occasionally discussed, to follow the shape of it. She got dressed quickly. She came downstairs. Her father looked at her, and his expression said that she should go wait in the parlor, that this was adult business, that she should not worry. She went to the parlor doorway and stayed there, just inside, where she could see the hallway and hear what was said. The solicitor was claiming that a parcel of land on the eastern boundary of the Voss property, 30 acres, that had been in the family for 4 generations, had been incorrectly recorded in the original title transfer document 60 years ago, and that a competing family, the Dalton family, had standing to claim it under a prior deed. He produced the documents. Her father looked at them with the expression of someone reading a foreign language with a dictionary they could not quite find. He called for his own man of business, who would not arrive for 2 hours. He called in a neighbor who had some knowledge of land matters, a man named Mr. Graves, who arrived within the hour and looked at the documents and said he believed the claim had some basis and they would need to consult a formal legal authority. By mid-morning, there were 5 people in the study: her father, the solicitor Mr. Pierce, Mr. Graves, another neighbor, and a young local lawyer named George Ellison, who had been sent for, but who was clearly operating at the edge of his competence with historical documents of this complexity. Ilara stood in the doorway of the study. No one was asking her to move. No one ever did. She was Ilara. She did not factor into calculations about who should be included in serious discussions. She read the documents from where she stood, over Mr. Graves's shoulder as he held them up. She read them once, then she read them again. And she felt something happen in her chest that was a specific kind of cold. the cold of someone who has understood something that no one else in the room has understood yet, and who understands the urgency of the understanding. The claim was fraudulent. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that the solicitor had been careless about. This had been constructed with enough knowledge of historical property law to fool someone who was not specifically expert in this precise type of transfer document. The fraud was in the interpretation of a clause in the original 60-year-old deed. The clause used a term that had had two accepted legal meanings in the period when it was written, and one of those meanings had since fallen out of use. The solicitor was exploiting the dead meaning. The living meaning, the one that had been legally operative at the time of the original transfer, and under the conventions of the jurisdiction, entirely invalidated the claim. She knew this because she had read the history of that very convention. She had read it in a legal history text she had found at the back of the library 3 years ago, and she had read it with the particular attention she gave to things that were unusual, and therefore likely to matter at some point. She stood in the doorway and watched the men in the room move through their confusion, and she watched the solicitor, Mr. Pierce, manage that confusion with practiced ease, and she watched her father's face settle into the gray color of a man watching something bad happen that he cannot stop. She knew she could stop it. She also knew, with perfect clarity, what it would cost her to stop it. If she spoke, she would have to speak with knowledge, not with the vague confusion of simple Ilara, who sometimes knew small things by accident. She would have to cite the convention. She would have to explain the historical context. She would have to reference the text she had read and the legal precedent she was drawing on, and she would have to do it with precision, because imprecision would not be enough to defeat a document this carefully constructed. There was no version of doing that correctly that did not reveal, to everyone in that room, that she was not who she had been pretending to be for 10 years. She stood in the doorway for a moment that was, in terms of actual seconds, perhaps 3 or 4, and in terms of internal experience, considerably longer. Her father signed nothing yet. The solicitor was talking. The other men were listening. She stepped into the room. "Father," she said. He turned. The solicitor turned. Mr. Graves and the young lawyer George Ellison turned. They all looked at her with the automatic, slightly patient expression people directed at her in serious situations. She was Ilara. She had walked into a business conversation. They would listen politely and guide her gently back out. She said, "May I see the document?" Her father started to say something kind and dismissive. The solicitor's face did something controlled that was trying not to be dismissive. Mr. Graves looked at her with the gentle expression of a man wondering whether to suggest she come back later. She said, without waiting, "The clause on the second page uses the term reversionary interest in a sense that was already legally obsolete at the time of the original transfer. Under the Harwick Convention of 1784, which governed property transfers in this region until 1831, the term had a specific operative meaning that excluded secondary claims of this type. The Dalton family's supposed prior deed would have to predate 1763 to be valid under either interpretation, and if it predates 1763, it falls under the older statute, which required attestation by 2 provincial witnesses. I do not see the attestation here." Complete silence. She did not waver. She had started the sentence, and she was going to finish what the sentence required. "If Mr. Pierce wishes to produce the attestation and demonstrate that the Harwick Convention does not apply in this specific instance," she said, "he should do so. If he cannot, the claim has no legal standing. The 30 acres are not in dispute." The silence continued. It lasted a very long time. The solicitor's professionally regretful expression had undergone a significant change. Mr. Graves was looking at the document in his hand, and then at her, and then at the document again. George Ellison had gone slightly pale in the way people do when they realize they have missed something important. Her father was very still. She did not look at any of them. She looked at the solicitor. She said, "Would you like to check the attestation provision?" Mr. Pierce said, after a pause, that he would need to review the documents further with his client. He left within 20 minutes. After he was gone, the room was very quiet. Ilara stood near the door. Her father was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not confusion. It was something that had no simple name, a kind of arriving at something, a landing, the expression of a man who had just understood that he had missed something large for a very long time, and was not yet sure how to hold that. Mr. Graves cleared his throat. He said something quietly to her father about an excellent outcome and that they should follow up formally. George Ellison gathered his papers. He glanced at Alara once, briefly, with an expression she did not entirely interpret and did not try to, and left. She did not know who else had been in the corridor during all of this. She had not looked. She had been too focused on the document, on the argument, on the precision required. She did not know that the Duke, who had called that morning on a matter with her father and been told to wait in the corridor, had been standing 8 feet from the doorway for the past 11 minutes. She did not know that he had heard every word. She found out later, not that day but later, that his expression during those 11 minutes had been, by his own account when he eventually told her, very hard to describe. He said it was the expression of someone watching something they had suspected being confirmed, and finding that confirmation much larger than expected. He said he had stood in the corridor and listened, and felt the particular stillness that comes when a long question is finally and completely answered. She did not know any of this at the time. At the time, she was standing in her father's study in the aftermath of what she had done, and the room was quiet, and her father was looking at her, and she was no longer pretending to be anything at all. 10 years. And it had ended in 11 minutes, over a fraudulent property claim and a legal convention from 1784. She waited for what came next. He found her in the garden, which was the only place she could be, because after what had happened in the study, she had needed air, and the garden was where she went when she needed air. And she had been sitting on the bench under the oak tree for the better part of an hour, when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path. She knew it was him before he came around the hedge. She had known, in the back of her mind, since she walked out of the study, that he had been in the corridor. She was not certain of it yet. The certainty came later, but something in the shape of the morning told her. He had been coming to call on her father. He had been there when she spoke. It was the kind of thing that happened when a story was moving toward its turning, and it required all the pieces to be in place. She did not run. She did not rearrange herself. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing in particular, in a posture that was simply the posture of a person who was tired, and had been sitting quietly, and was not performing anything at all. He came around the hedge and stopped when he saw her. A brief stop, just enough to register that she was there, that she had seen him, that she was not going to pretend she had not seen him. "Miss Voss," he said. "Duke Caney," she said. He walked over and stood a few feet away. He did not sit. He looked at the garden for a moment, with the expression of a man deciding how to begin a conversation that does not have an obvious beginning. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting for one thing or another for 10 years. He said, "I was in the corridor this morning." "I thought you might have been," she said. Another brief pause. "I heard what you said to the solicitor." "Yes," she said. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized, because she had seen versions of it in the mirror, at moments when she had allowed herself to be fully present in her own face. It was the expression of someone not hiding anything, which was a rarer thing than most people realized. He said, "How long?" She said, 10 years. He was quiet for a moment, not a surprised quiet, a considering quiet. "Why?" he said. She looked back at the garden. She thought about the various careful, partial, diplomatic answers she could give. She thought about them, organized them, and then set them down. She was too tired for diplomacy, and she was talking to a man who she had known for 3 weeks, and who had, in 3 weeks, gotten closer to the truth of her than most people had managed in the previous decade. She owed him something closer to honesty than diplomacy, and she was, she noticed, not afraid to give it to him. That was new. She said, "Because every arrangement that was ever made for me was made without asking me what I wanted. Because the women I watched who accepted those arrangements spent the rest of their lives being accommodated and redirected and talked around by people who loved them, and still managed, in the loving, to make them smaller. Because I read enough and thought enough to know that I had a mind worth protecting, and I could not protect it and also be what was expected of me. So I chose the mind." He was quiet for a while. She waited. He said, "The library." "Yes," she said. "The cross-referencing. I was using 2 texts to confirm a legal principle. The pencil behind your ear." She almost smiled. That was careless. "It was," he said. not unkindly. Almost the way you would say it to someone you were working alongside on something. She looked up at him again. He was still standing, still looking at her, and his expression had not changed very much, but something in it had settled into a quality that was not quite what she had expected from him in this moment. She had expected something more formally composed. What she was seeing instead was something that was simply direct. He said, "The property claim this morning. You knew exactly what it was before you opened your mouth." "I had read the convention it was based on," she said. 3 years ago. It is not well known. Most practitioners of current law would not catch it." He said. "George Ellison did not catch it." "No," she said. "And you said nothing for several minutes." "I was deciding whether to say anything at all." "What decided you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Honestly, my father's face. He was going to lose the land, and he was not going to understand why. And I could not sit there and watch that happen when I could stop it." The Duke looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You gave up 10 years of work in 30 seconds. "I know," she said. He moved then, in a way she did not quite anticipate. He turned and sat down on the bench beside her, not too close, a proper distance, but on the same bench. He looked at the garden the way she had been looking at it. They sat in silence for a moment. She realized after a minute that the silence was not uncomfortable. She had expected discomfort, the specific heavy discomfort of exposure, of being known without permission. What she felt instead was something more like stillness, as if something that had been held at constant tension had been set down. He said, "What happens now?" She said, "I do not know. I have never reached this part before." He turned his head and looked at her, and something in his expression shifted into something that might, if she was reading it correctly, have been the faintest approach of a real smile. "Neither have I," he said. "Not quite like this." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the measured way he said most things, but with less of the professional composure, and more of the actual man underneath it, "I have spent a considerable part of my adult life negotiating a world that expected me to be a specific thing, and had very little interest in what I actually was. I have handled that differently than you did, but I recognize the situation." She considered this. She let it sit and become a real thing before she responded. She said, "What did you do?" He said, "I became very good at the expected thing, and found ways to do the actual thing, in spaces where no one was looking. It is less elegant than your method, more cooperative with the structure, but," she said, "but," he said, "but also lonelier, in certain ways." They sat with that. The garden was quiet. A bird moved through the oak tree above them. The morning sun had come through properly now, and the garden was lit in the way that happens when the early haze burns off. She said, after a while, "You have not asked what I intend to do next." He said, "I was giving you time to think about it." She said, "That is a very considerate approach for someone who just sat down uninvited on my bench." He said, without pausing, "It is your father's bench, technically." She did smile then. A real one. A full one. Not the managed warmth she had deployed for 10 years. It moved across her face, the way smiles do, when they have not been performing anything. He saw it. He did not make a production of seeing it. He simply looked at the garden again, with the expression of someone who has just found what they came to find, and does not need to announce it. She said, "I do not know what comes next. I know what has to come next practically. The household will have to adjust to a different version of me, which will not be entirely comfortable for anyone involved. My father will have questions. I do not know how to answer most of them yet." He said, "Start with one." She said, "Is that advice?" He said, "It is an observation. One question at a time is usually more manageable than all of them at once." She said, "What was your one question?" "When you started trying to find out who I was." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The first one was, is she doing this deliberately?" Once I was certain the answer was yes, the only question left was why. And now you know why. And now I know why, he said. She said, "What will you do with it?" He turned and looked at her, directly, without the careful peripheral attention he had been using for 3 weeks. He looked at her the way people look when they are not managing an observation but simply being present. He said, Nothing you do not want me to do. She looked back at him. The sun was on the garden, and the birds were in the tree, and below them, the Voss estate grounds, spread out in the ordinary way that ordinary places do, unchanged by anything that had just happened in them. She said, "That is a very unusual thing for a man in your position to say." He said, "I have found that unusual positions tend to produce unusual things." She said nothing for a moment. He said, "You do not have to decide anything today." She said, "I know." She looked at the garden. "But I would like to ask you a question." He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you know, before this morning, how much I knew? Not just that I was pretending, but the actual scope of it." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I knew you were intelligent. I suspected it was considerable. The library, the conversation, the way your eyes moved when you were managing your responses." He paused. "But the property law text this morning was beyond what I had estimated. Not because I did not think you capable of it, because the specificity of it was remarkable. The particular clause, the particular convention, cited exactly." She said, "I have been reading for 10 years with nothing to do with it." He said, "I know." Something in his voice had changed. "That is," he stopped. She looked at him. He said, more carefully, "That is one of the things I found most difficult to sit with, listening from the corridor." She waited. He said, "That you have been doing all of that, alone, for that long, with nowhere for it to go." She was quiet. She said, "Eventually, it had somewhere to go. I had the journal. I had the library. I had the small ways I could act on things without being seen. It was not nothing." He said, "No, but it was not everything it could have been." She did not answer that. Not because she disagreed, but because it was true, in a way that still had an edge on it, and she was not quite ready to let the edge touch anything directly. They sat for a little longer. Then she said, "I am going to need to go inside. There will be things to address." He said, "Of course." She stood. He stood with her. They were face to face for a moment, at a proper distance, in the ordinary light of a late morning. She said, "Thank you for not." She stopped, finding the exact word. He said, "For not doing something with it before you were ready." She said, "Yes." He said, "I did not see the point." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 10 years of being very good at reading people from behind a performance, and about how strange it was to be reading someone now without the performance between them. She said, "I am not sure what I am, exactly, without the version I have been being. I will have to find out." He said, "That seems interesting." She said, "Does it?" He said, "Yes, considerably." She looked at him once more, in a way that she did not attempt to manage or direct, and then she turned and walked back toward the house. He watched her go. He stood in the garden for a few minutes after she had gone inside, in the quiet of it, with the bird in the oak tree and the sun on everything. He had known it was going to be a complicated thing when he found it. He had known from early on, from something in the texture of those first 2 dinners, that whatever was under the surface of that careful performance was worth the patience required to reach it. He had been right. He was glad he had been right. He turned and walked back to where his horse was waiting, and he rode back to the Whitmore estate, and he sat in the quiet of his room for a while, and thought about how a story that had been moving in one direction for 10 years had just begun moving in another. He was, he found, not at all sorry about that. The day after the documents, Ilara's father asked to speak with her in his study. She had expected this. She had spent the previous evening preparing for it, not with notes or practiced lines, but with the quiet internal work of someone assembling themselves for a difficult thing. She had lain awake for several hours, not with dread exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone approaching the end of a long habit that has defined them for a very long time. She sat across from her father, in the familiar chair she had sat in for 26 years. The study smelled like old paper and lamp oil. He was at his desk, and his hands were folded on the surface in front of him, and he looked like a man who had been up most of the night too. He said, "Ilara." She said, "Father." He said, "How long have you been able to do that?" She said, "Do what?" He said, very quietly, "You know what?" She did not pretend. She was done with that. She said, "Since I was 14, in various forms." The legal material specifically, probably since I was 19 or 20. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And the way you have been, for all these years, you did that deliberately." "Yes," she said. He was quiet again. The clock on the mantelpiece went through one of its ticking cycles and then was quiet again. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I did not want to be given to someone who had no interest in who I actually was, and I could not see another way to prevent it." He looked at her. His expression was hard to read in the way that the expressions of people who are holding several things at once are always hard to read. There was pain in it. There was something that might have been, underneath the pain, a complicated kind of respect. There was the expression of a man who was revising a very large thing in real time and was not sure yet what the revision meant. He said, "You did not trust me." She said, carefully but honestly, "I did not think you would understand. And I did not think you had the power to change the way things were, even if you wanted to." He said, "That is not the same as trust." She said, "No, it is not." He looked at his desk. He was quiet for a long while. She let him be quiet. She owed him the time. He said, "Your mother." She said, "Mother saw what she expected to see. I think she found it easier." He said, "She will not find this easy." "No," Alara said. He said, "Clara." Alara looked at her hands. "Clara told me to be cleverer than her, in her letter. I do not think she knew she was giving me a method." Her father said nothing for a while. Then he said, in a different tone, quieter, and without the formal furniture of a concerned parent, asking difficult questions. "What you said this morning. About the Harwick Convention." "Yes," she said. He said, "George Ellison looked it up this afternoon. He said you were exactly right. He said he had never encountered the text you were citing, and spent 2 hours trying to find it." "I can show him where it is," she said. "It is in the collection at the back of the library, the older section. 3rd shelf from the bottom, left grouping." Her father looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I did not know I had that in my house." She said, "You have quite a lot in there. The collection is very good." He said, "I have never used it." She said, "I know." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was neither comfortable nor entirely uncomfortable. It was the look of two people discovering each other across a longer distance than either of them had known existed, and not yet knowing what to do about the distance, but at least knowing it was there.
He said after a while.
"Are you well?" She said, "Yes." "I am tired." "But yes." He said, "Are you frightened?" She considered this honestly. She said, "A little. Not in the way I expected to be." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "I expected to feel exposed. I feel more like something that was held up for a long time has been put down." He was quiet. Then he said, "I am sorry you felt you could not put it down before this." She looked at him. He was not saying it to perform regret. He was saying it because it was true, and he meant it, and he was a man who, underneath the limitations of his time and position and expectations, was genuinely trying to understand his daughter, and was perhaps doing it, this morning, better than he had done it in the previous 26 years. She said, "I know." They sat quietly for a moment. He said, "Duke Caney came to speak with me this morning. Before the solicitor. I asked him to wait, and then the whole business happened, and I did not see him after. Do you know if he left?" She said, carefully, "I spoke with him briefly, in the garden." Her father looked at her. She said, "He had been in the corridor during the documents." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I see." She said, "He is not going to do anything with it that I do not agree to." Her father looked at her for a long moment. He said, "He said that?" "Yes," she said. Her father looked at his desk. He seemed to be processing something. He said, "He is a man of considerable standing." She said, "I know." He said, "He could make things very difficult, if he chose to." She said, "I know that too. He is choosing not to." Her father was quiet. He said, "What does he want, in return?" She said, "He has not asked for anything. He said I did not have to decide anything yet." Another quiet. He said, "That is unusual." She said, "Yes, It is. He looked at her again, with the expression of a man whose understanding of a situation is shifting under his feet, and who is trying to keep his balance. He said, Ilara, what do you want? She was quiet for a long time. It was the question she had never been asked. She had structured 10 years around the answer to a different question. What do you not want? What are you protecting? What is the cost worth paying? And the answer to that question she knew in her bones. But this question, the direct one, the simple one, the one that required her to look at the future, rather than the wall she had built against it, that question was harder. She said, slowly, I want to use what I have. I want to use my mind for real things. I want to have honest conversations with people who can receive them. I want to not feel like I am performing constantly. She paused. I want to find out what I actually am, when I stop being what I have had to be. Her father was very still. He said, I should have asked you that a long time ago. She said, we did not know each other well enough. He said, no, I suppose we did not. She stood up. She smoothed her dress in the old habit. She looked at her father, who was still sitting at his desk, with his hands folded, and his face showing more of itself than she had seen in her memory. She said, I am going to figure this out. Whatever comes next, I will be careful about it. He said, you have always been careful. She said, about the wrong things, sometimes. He said nothing, but he nodded. And something in that nod was an acknowledgement of more than just the words. She went to the door. He said, Ilara. She turned. He said, the documents this morning. You saved the land. She said, yes. He said, thank you. She said, of course. She left. She went to the library, because the library was where she went when she needed to think, and she closed the door behind her, and she stood in the familiar smell of it, and looked at the shelves she had spent 10 years living inside in secret, and she thought about what it would feel like to use them openly. Strange, she decided. It would feel very strange, and also like something long held under water coming up into the air. She was not sure what happened next. She was not sure what shape her life was going to take now that its primary organizing principle, the concealment, was gone. She was not sure what she and the Duke were to each other, or were going to be, or whether the conversation in the garden was the beginning of something, or simply an unusual morning in a series of unusual mornings. She was not sure of any of it. She was, for the first time in a decade, not sure about her life, and not afraid of not being sure. The not knowing felt like open ground, rather than a drop. That was new. That was, she thought, something to pay attention to. She pulled a book from the shelf, a familiar one, a favorite, one she had read so many times the spine knew the opening without being asked, and she sat down in the chair by the window, in the afternoon light, and she read it for pleasure. Just for pleasure. In the middle of the day, without closing the door first, without listening for footsteps, without the pencil behind her ear, already half ready to be hidden. It was a small thing. It was also, quietly, the first free thing she had done in 10 years. 3 weeks after the morning of the solicitor, Ilara's life was both completely changed and in many ways completely the same, which was the strange thing about real change. It happened all at once, and then required enormous amounts of ordinary time to catch up to. Her household knew. That was the most significant shift. Her mother had been told. Her father had done it, which Ilara was grateful for, and the conversation had produced a long and complicated afternoon that Ilara had heard fragments of through the sitting room door, and had chosen not to try to hear in full. Her mother had emerged from that afternoon, looking like a woman who had reorganized a very large piece of furniture, and was not yet sure it was in the right place. She had come to Ilara's room that evening, and sat on the edge of the bed and said, in a voice that was careful and trying very hard, I wish you had felt you could tell me. Ilara had said, I know. Her mother had said, I did not know you were unhappy. Ilara had said, I was not exactly unhappy. I was managing. Her mother had seemed to find this answer more difficult than unhappy would have been. She had sat for a little while. Then she had said, the blue silk. Ilara had said, what about it? Her mother had said, you said it was complicated to put on. Ilara had said, it is slightly complicated to put on. Her mother had said, very quietly, but that was not the real reason. Ilara had said, no. Her mother had pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was holding a large feeling at a controlled distance. She had said, "Will you wear it now? To the Whitmore dinner next week, perhaps." Ilara had said, "Yes, I would like that." The blue dress, the dinner, the ordinary logistics of a life beginning to arrange itself differently. She wore the blue dress. It was the first time she had worn it in public, and she had not entirely anticipated how it would feel. Not the dress, but the being herself that the dress represented. She had walked into the Whitmore estate in a room full of people who had known Ilara Voss for years in a particular way. And she was the same person walking in, and she was also, in every practical sense, someone those people had not met. She did not announce anything. She had no interest in spectacle. She had simply come to a dinner as herself, and herself meant she said what she thought when it was worth saying, answered questions with the real answer, and did not manage her expressions into comfortable nothing. The effect was interesting to observe. People who had spent years being gently patient with simple Ilara were suddenly finding that Ilara had views and knowledge and warmth with substance behind it, and they were handling this with varying degrees of grace. Some people were charmed by the discovery. Some people were confused. One woman, a neighbor who had always been kind in the pitying way, was visibly unsettled in a way she was working hard to conceal, which Ilara found interesting and chose not to engage with. He was across the table from her for most of it, and she was aware of him in the specific way she had been aware of him since the morning in the garden. It was a different awareness from what she had felt in the weeks before the documents. Then, she had watched him with the strategic attention of someone managing a threat. Now the watching was something else, interested, and more personal than she had let things be personal in a very long time. He watched her too, not in the patient, investigative way of before, in a straightforward way, not staring, not performing interest, just the easy directness of a person who has decided they are interested, and is not hiding it. She found she did not mind being watched in that particular way. Toward the end of the evening, there was a break in the main gathering, while the older members of the party settled into a card game. Ilara went to the window, because windows remained her preferred position at social events, even when she was not using them for strategic invisibility. The Duke came and stood beside her. He said, "How was this?" She said, "Strange." He said, "Better or worse strange?" She said, "Better, mostly." One person was disturbed by it. He said, "Which one?" She told him. He considered this. He said, "She will adjust, or she will not. Either way." She said, "Either way," and found she agreed. They stood at the window for a while, looking out at the Whitmore garden in the evening. It was well maintained, formal plantings, a long walk with borders, everything very considered. She preferred the Voss garden, which was messier and had better birds. She said, "I have been thinking about the question you asked in the garden." He said, "Which one?" She said, "What happens now?" He said, "What have you been thinking?" She said, "I have been thinking that I do not know, but that I want to find out in a way that I am choosing, rather than being arranged into." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have also been thinking that I have never had a real conversation with a person who was interested in what I actually knew, rather than performing interest in what they expected me to know." He said, "I can tell." She looked at him. "How?" He said, "Because you have spent the last 3 evenings slightly holding back. I can see it. You will start a thought, and then you check whether you should say it." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I have a lot of things I have only ever said in the journal." He said, "Tell me one." She considered. She said, "I think the standard interpretation of the trade dispute resolution from 7 years ago was wrong. Not in its conclusion, in its reasoning. The reasoning was backwards. They got the right answer by accident." He said, "Why backwards?" She said, "Because they argued from the precedent to the case, when the case was actually incompatible with the precedent, and required them to establish a new one. Grounding it in the old precedent means the resolution only holds until someone challenges the underlying premise, which anyone with specific knowledge of the 1779 Charter could do." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Who told you about the 1779 Charter?" She said, "No one. I read it." He said, "Where did you find it?" She said, "The third shelf, left grouping, behind the hunting records." He said, very quietly, Has anyone else read it? She said, I do not believe so. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the trade dispute is still technically open. The parties agreed to a resolution, but the agreement was never formally ratified because one of the signatories, the Dalton interest, actually, related to the family from your father's situation, contested a procedural element. It has been sitting dormant for 7 years because no one could identify the problem. She looked at him. She said, I did not know it was still open. He said, almost no one does. It is genuinely unresolved. She said, if I showed you what I mean about the 1779 charter. He said, yes. She said, yes what? He said, yes, I want to see it. Yes, it matters. Yes, this is the kind of thing that should be heard by someone who can do something with it. He looked at her directly. You have been putting things in the journal because there was nowhere else for them to go. There are places for them to go. She was quiet. He said, that is not a vague offer. That is a specific one. I have access to people who handle these cases. If your reading of the charter is what you think it could resolve 7 years of legal ambiguity and protect a significant number of people whose livelihoods depend on the clarity of that agreement. She said, I am a woman who until 3 weeks ago was considered simple by everyone who knew her. He said, you are a woman who knows where the 1779 charter is and what it says. The first fact is going to become irrelevant very quickly. She looked at him. The window was behind them, and the room was warm, and the evening was doing the particular thing that evenings do when something has shifted, and everything looks slightly different in the changed light. She said, you are very certain. He said, I am, when I have enough information. She said, you have not read the charter. He said, no, but I have read you, more carefully than most things, for 3 weeks. That is sufficient. She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the Whitmore garden was settled in its formal order. In 3 weeks, something had come apart, and something else had not yet come together, and she was standing in the middle of it in a blue silk dress, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she had been carrying for a long time. She said, all right. He said, all right. She said, the charter. We will look at it. And whatever the conversation is after that, I want to have it. The real one. The kind I have never had before. He said, I have wanted that too, for longer than 3 weeks. She looked at him. He said, since the library, since the Latin texts, in order on the shelf, I did not know what you were yet, but I knew I wanted to know. She said, you were very patient. He said, you were worth it. She did not have a quick answer for that. It was the kind of statement that required a moment to receive. She looked out the window. She said, eventually, I still do not know who I am, exactly, without the performance. He said, you are the person who cited the Harwick Convention in front of a fraudulent solicitor and did not blink. She said, I blinked a little internally. He said, yes, but not outwardly. That is the useful part. She smiled, the full smile again. She was getting slightly more practiced at letting it out without stopping it. He saw it again, the same way he had seen it in the garden. He said, I have been doing something this morning that I should probably tell you about. She looked at him. What? He said, I went to the library. Your father gave me permission to look at the collection. I found the shelf you described. She said, and? He said, the 1779 charter was exactly where you said. I read the section you are referring to. She said, and? He said, and you are correct. The reasoning is backwards. The resolution is sitting on a premise that the 1779 charter directly contradicts. She was very still. He said, I have already sent a letter this afternoon to the relevant legal authority with a summary of the issue. I cited the charter and the argument, your argument. I attributed it correctly. She said, you attributed it to me. He said, yes. She said, using my name. He said, your name and your analysis. Both are correct. Both belong to you. She was quiet for a long moment. She said, people will find it odd. He said, some will. They will find it less odd over time. She said, you are very calm about this. He said, I am calm about things I am certain of. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the evening was doing the thing it had been doing, and she was in the blue dress, and the conversation she was having was the most real conversation she had ever had with another person, and she was 26 years old, and tired of performing, and the journal under the floorboard was very full of things that had finally found somewhere to go. She said, "I have more." He said, "I expected so." She said, "In the journal. Things I have been thinking about for years. Other cases, other documents. Things I noticed and had no way to use." He said, "Tell me all of it." She said, "That will take a very long time." He said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the steadiness of a person saying something they have thought about and mean, he said, "I have time." She looked at him one more time, in the changed light of the evening, and she believed him. And for the first time in 10 years, she did not feel the need to be careful about what she said next. She began to talk. She talked for a long time. He listened in the way he did everything, completely, without interruption, without performance. And the room around them went on being warm, and the other guests went on with their card games and their conversations, and no one who looked over would have seen anything more notable than two people standing at a window talking. But inside that quiet conversation, something that had been underground for 10 years came up into the light at last. It was not finished. It was only beginning. There was still the household to manage, and her mother to navigate, and the world to address, and her own understanding of herself to rebuild now that the architecture of the performance was coming down. There was the 1779 charter, and whatever came after it, and whatever came after that. There was the long and complicated and genuinely interesting question of who Alara Voss was when she stopped performing, which she was only just beginning to find out. But she was finding out. And she was finding out in real time, in a real conversation, with a real person who had looked at her with specific intention and waited until she was visible and then said, simply, "Tell me." That was enough. That was, she thought, more than enough. It was the beginning. They said afterward, the ones who were there in those months and years, and who later tried to describe what it looked like when Alara Voss stopped pretending, that what changed was not easy to define. It was not that she became a different person, it was that the person she had always been became visible, and visible in a way that had its own particular force. The province had known her for a long time as a specific thing. The reputations of people in a small provincial world are deeply embedded. They are not constructed from evidence so much as from expectation, and once the expectation is formed, it becomes the lens through which evidence is filtered. Simple Alara had been a settled category, a comfortable one, a known one. What happened after the solicitor, after the garden, after the Whitmore dinner in the blue dress, was that the category broke. It did not break all at once. It broke the way old structures break, first a crack, then another, then a shift that was too large to manage, and then the whole shape of it different. The first crack was the solicitor himself. He had left the Voss study with the particular expression of a man who has had a plan fail in a way he had not anticipated, and who was calculating the fallout. He went back to the Dalton family, who had engaged him to pursue the claim, and he told them that the claim was not viable. He did not explain why in detail. He did not mention who had identified the problem. But people talk. The solicitor talked to his clerk, who talked to someone at the local merchant office, who mentioned it to someone at a dinner, and within 2 weeks, the outline of what had happened was circulating. That the Voss family had been threatened with a fraudulent land claim, and that the fraud had been identified and dismantled before it could succeed, and that the person who had identified it was the younger Voss daughter. This information traveled through the province with the speed that interesting information always travels, which is to say very quickly. It hit the existing image of Alara like a stone hitting glass, not shattering it immediately, but producing a web of fracture lines that made the original image impossible to sustain. People responded in different ways. Some were delighted. These were usually people who had always liked Alara without particularly thinking about her, and who found the revelation that she had been quietly exceptional all along to be a satisfying story. They adjusted without too much difficulty and became enthusiastic about the new version. Some were confused. These were people for whom the original image had been comfortable, and the revision required more adjustment than they were immediately prepared for. They tended to ask questions like, "But when did this happen?" and How did no one know? And they were asking the questions in good faith. They just needed more time. Some were uncomfortable. A smaller group, but a visible one. These were people for whom the discovery that Alara had been something other than what she appeared was not a charming revelation, but a mild unsettling of something they had depended on. The idea that the world was legible and that people were what they presented. The idea that a young woman had maintained a decade-long performance of this precision without detection was, to people with this temperament, slightly destabilizing. They did not say so directly. They expressed it as concern. Was she quite all right? Had she been unhappy? Was it very strange that she had done this? Alara heard all of it. She addressed none of it directly. She had spent 10 years responding to the province's version of her. She did not feel obligated to manage the transition for them. She was polite. She was warm. She was, in fact, much warmer now that she was not expending enormous energy managing what she said, because warmth is easier when it is genuine, and she had always genuinely liked people. She just also now had opinions, and knowledge, and the settled, slightly irreversible quality of a person who has decided they are done with being managed. Her mother was the adjustment that required the most sustained attention. Not because her mother was unkind, she was not, but because her mother was someone who had built her own understanding of Alara over 26 years, and rebuilding it required her to also rebuild something about herself. She had to reckon with the fact that she had not seen her own daughter. That was not a comfortable reckoning. They worked through it in the way that mothers and daughters work through hard things, imperfectly, with pauses and detours and occasional conversations that almost said the real thing, and then went sideways into something easier, and then tried again. It took months. It was not entirely finished at the end of those months, but it was better, and it was real, and that mattered more than finished. Her father was easier, in the end. Not because the reckoning was smaller, it was not, but because her father was the kind of person who, once he understood something, moved on to what to do about it with relative efficiency. He had understood. He had felt the appropriate things, and then he had, within a week of the solicitor, asked Alara to sit with him while he reviewed a contract for a property matter he was managing, and had listened to her observations about it with the close attention of a man taking seriously something he had previously not known to take seriously. He had changed the contract based on 3 of her 4 observations. He had explained why he disagreed with the 4th. She had considered his explanation and found it partly right and told him so. It was the most real conversation she had ever had with her father. It lasted an hour and a half. They had more of them. George Ellison, the young lawyer who had been called to the Voss estate on the morning of the solicitor, came back. He came with his hat in his hands and a straightforward manner, and said he had spent a considerable amount of time thinking about what she had cited, and he had found the material, and he had some questions. She answered the questions. He came back with more. She answered those. He came back again. Eventually she said, plainly, that if he was going to keep coming back, they might as well establish a regular appointment, and he had agreed with the evident relief of someone who has been trying to find a way to say the same thing. He became a professional associate. He became, in time, something closer to a collaborator. He was a practical, decent man who was genuinely committed to doing his work correctly, and he understood, once she had demonstrated it sufficiently, that she was a resource he would be foolish to ignore, regardless of the unconventional nature of the situation. The letters began arriving. The first one was a formal acknowledgement from the legal authority to whom the Duke had written about the 1779 charter analysis. The acknowledgement was addressed to Alara by name, which she held in her hands for a moment before opening it, because she had never received a formal professional acknowledgement addressed to her by name, and the fact of it was something she needed a moment with. The letter said that her analysis had been received and reviewed by 3 authorities, and that all 3 concurred with her reading, and that proceedings were being initiated to properly resolve the 7-year-old dispute on the correct basis. It thanked her by name for the analysis, and said that her identification of the 1779 charter was of considerable significance to the resolution. She read it twice. She put it on her desk. She went to the window and looked out at the garden for a few minutes. She felt something that was not pride, or not only pride, but was the particular, specific feeling of having done a real thing in the real world, under your own name, where it counted. She wrote back a reply that was professional and detailed and used her full name at the bottom. More letters came. Not all of them to do with that specific case. Word had a way of moving through the networks of people who handled such matters, and her name was attached now to a piece of work that had impressed people who were not easily impressed. And those people mentioned her to other people, who then wrote to ask if she might look at something, consider something, offer a view. She did. She was careful about it. She was selective. She did not say yes to everything. She chose the things that were genuinely interesting, and in which she had knowledge that was real, rather than merely sufficient. Because she had spent 10 years doing nothing but building knowledge, and she knew very precisely the edges of it. The Duke came to the Voss estate regularly. Not every day, not in any way that was formal or arranged with the family in an official capacity. He simply came. He came to talk about the cases, which was how it began, and then he came because he wanted to, which was what it became. He and Alara sat in the garden, or in the library, openly now, in daylight, with no hiding of pencils or books, and they talked about everything: the cases, the province, history, philosophy, the particular experience of being a person who finds the world genuinely interesting and has spent time navigating institutions not designed for people who find the world interesting. He was, she found, the person she had been unconsciously describing when she told her father that she wanted to have real conversations with people who could receive them. He received them and reflected them back in ways that were themselves interesting, and he disagreed with her sometimes in ways that were worth disagreeing about, and he held his positions when he was right, and changed them when she was, and both of these things were equally valuable. She had never had this before. She had not known precisely what she was missing. She found it was considerable. The province continued to adjust to the new version of things. The neighborhood families came to dinner and encountered the real Alara and went home and talked about her in different terms than before. Some of them came back with specific questions, having remembered conversations they had been present for over the years, in which her opinion on some matter had been irrelevant, and now it was not irrelevant, and they wanted to know what she had actually thought. She told them. It was not always what they expected. She was not interested in being diplomatic for the sake of comfort. She was interested in being honest, in ways that were worth being honest about, and the combination of her warmth and her directness was, she found, something that people responded to. Not all people, not immediately, but broadly. She was not performing sweetness anymore. She was just herself, and herself had been shaped by a decade of solitary thought, and was genuinely warm, and also genuinely direct. And that combination was unusual enough to be worth paying attention to. A former suitor, a man named Lord Clifton, who had visited the estate when she was 22, and departed in 2 days, sent a letter. It was a stiff, careful letter that was trying to be pleasant while also being embarrassed, and it said something about being glad to hear she was well, and that he had always thought her a very nice young woman. She did not reply to that particular letter. There was one afternoon in the library in the early autumn, several months after everything had changed, when she was at the window with a book, and the Duke was in the chair across from her with his own, and the house was quiet, and the light was the particular golden color of that season, and she looked up from her book, and he was already looking at her, and she said, "What?" He said, "I was thinking about the library." She said, "Which specific thought about it?" He said, "The first time I came in through the garden door." She said, "That was very inconvenient timing on your part." He said, "On the contrary." She said, "You are going to tell me it was fortunate." He said, "I was going to say it was the most interesting thing that had happened to me in a considerable time." She considered this. She said, "You saw a woman on a ladder with a pencil behind her ear." He said, "I saw someone who was entirely themselves, in a way they thought they were alone to be. That is a very specific and valuable thing to see." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I was very alarmed." He said, "I know, you did not show it." She said, "I showed enough." He said, "Yes, enough for me to understand." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to tell you something." She said, "All right." He said, "I have not come here, all these weeks, because of the cases or the legal work or the 1779 charter. Those are real, and they matter, and I am genuinely glad the work is happening. But I come here because of you. That is the real reason." She looked at him. He said, "I wanted to say it plainly. Because I think you deserve plain things." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I come to the window because you are there." He said, "I know." She said, "That is also plain." He said, "Yes." Something in his face shifted into the quieter version of the expression she was coming to know. Not the composed professional face, not the careful social face, but the one she saw when he was simply being himself, which was the one she liked most. "What do you want to do about it?" She thought about the question. She thought about how different this was from any answer she had ever been asked to give about her own future. She thought about how she was 26 and had spent 10 years making decisions based on what she did not want, and she was in a position now to make them based on what she did. She said, "I want to keep doing this. The work, the talking. I want to keep coming to the window and having you be there." He said, "I want that too." She said, "I do not want to be managed. I do not want to be spoken around. I do not want a version of things where I disappear back into being accommodated." He said, "I know." She said, "You say that very certainly." He said, "Because I have been paying close attention for several months, and I have never seen a person less likely to allow accommodation. It would require active and sustained effort to manage you in any direction you did not choose." She said, "That is true." He said, "I am not interested in that effort. I am interested in the actual conversation." She looked at him. This person she had been watching, and being watched by for months, who had followed a thread she did not know she was leaving, and found the thing at the end of it, and who had then sat with her in the garden, and asked her one question, and listened to the answer, and not made it into a thing she needed to be afraid of. She said, "Then let us keep having it." He said, "Yes." And they did. They had the conversation that afternoon, and the next day, and the next. They had it through the autumn and into the winter, and they had it about everything. The work, and the province, and the books on the shelves, and the things she had written in the journal over 10 years, and the things he had thought in his own private version of the same kind of solitude, the solitude of the person who finds the world interesting, and has had to be strategic about where they showed it. The province settled, eventually, into a new version of knowing her. It took longer for some people than others. It was not always comfortable, but it happened. Her mother wore the expression of a woman learning something large and adjusting to the size of it, and over time the expression became something more like the particular warmth of a parent who has found their child again in an unexpected place. Her father reviewed contracts with her and lost 2 arguments and won one, and was quietly proud about the one he won, in a way that she found endearing. George Ellison sent her cases and asked for her analysis, and addressed her correspondence with the professional respect of a man who had updated his understanding and was not going back. The 1779 Charter was formally incorporated into the resolution of the trade dispute, which was resolved in the spring, with an outcome that was fair to the parties involved and legally sound, for the first time in 7 years. The acknowledgement from the legal authority mentioned her name in the formal record. She kept that letter in the library, not under the floorboard, on the shelf where the charter itself was. The journal was still there, under the floorboard. She did not move it. She kept writing in it. Not to hide thoughts now, but because she had been doing it for 10 years, and the habit of writing down what she really thought had become one of the most valuable things about herself that she knew of. She was not going to stop a good habit just because the circumstances had changed. She opened the floorboard one afternoon in the winter, and took the journal out and held it for a moment. 12 years of thinking. 12 years of herself, compressed into pages that no one had ever read. She had thought about this, about whether to share it, about whether any of it was worth the world's attention. She had decided it was a question for later. For now it was enough that she had written it, and that it existed, and that the person in its pages was the person she was choosing to be going forward. She put it back. She would keep writing. She would see what it became. She went to the window. Outside, the winter garden was bare and ordered, and still in the morning frost. In an hour, she had an appointment with George Ellison about a land matter in the northern part of the province that had some interesting complications. After that, in the afternoon, the Duke was coming to work through a correspondence about the charter's implications for related cases that had been identified by the authority. She was busy. She was, in the specific way she had wanted to be, and had not been for 10 years, genuinely and continuously occupied by real work that mattered. She looked at the garden. She thought about the bench under the oak tree where she had been sitting when he came around the hedge that morning. She thought about 10 years of the library and the pencil and the floorboard and the careful, sustained, lonely, necessary, costly performance that had been her life for so long, that it had become a kind of home, even as it was a kind of prison. She did not regret it, or not entirely. She had done what she needed to do with the options she had, and she had done it well, and it had given her the time to become the person she needed to become before she could be that person openly. But she was glad it was over. She was very glad it was over. She left the window and got her coat and went to meet George Ellison, walking through the house with the comfortable, particular pace of a person who is entirely at home in the space they occupy, not watching corners or listening for footsteps or preparing any face other than her own. The house was just the house. The library was just the library. The garden was the garden, frost-covered and still, and full of birds she could name in 3 languages, none of which she was keeping to herself anymore. She opened the front door and went out into the cold morning. She was Alara Voss. She had been, for 10 years, a performance of someone else entirely. And she had been, underneath it, always, exactly this. And now the world was going to find that out, one conversation at a time, for as long as it took. Which was, she thought, walking down the drive into the clear cold air, with her breath making small clouds in front of her, more than fine. It was, in fact, the most interesting thing that had ever happened to her. And it was only beginning.